This image has been widely circulated in news reports and documentaries. Giant cargo ships glide smoothly between lush tropical shores, connecting east and west in a continuous flow.
A perfectly tuned mechanism moves millions of tons of goods through a narrow isthmus.
It seems as though this waterway exists as naturally as the oceans themselves, performing its functions silently and reliably. Global trade looks like a solved mathematical problem, embodied in steel and concrete. But the smooth surface of the water conceals one of the most brutal and exhausting battles against physical reality. This route has never been a natural artery, and its uninterrupted operation is by no means a given. Behind the facade of an engineering triumph lies a history of constantly teetering on the brink of disaster. Every mile traveled here has been paid for with lives, colossal strain on machinery, and relentless violence against the geology. The toll runs into millions of cubic meters of sliding mud, grinding heavy machinery to dust. Epidemics decimated armies of workers faster than steamships could deliver new batches of people to replace them. Huge volumes of fresh water are dumped daily and irretrievably into the salty ocean, simply so that the system can take another breath.
The entire global economy, dependent on this narrow bottleneck, is effectively hanging by a thread in the unpredictable tropical climate.
This structure is not merely a convenient transit route. It is an artificial valve, aggressively implanted into the continent's narrowest and most vulnerable spot. It is an extremely complex instrument for controlling planetary time and space, a geopolitical weapon disguised as a neutral transport hub. The project was conceived as a way to compress the world, subjugating ocean logistics to a single will. By the end of this story, it will become absolutely clear why massive concrete walls demand a continuous and exhausting struggle for survival. You will come to understand how a simple seasonal drought can paralyze half the globe. The triumph over nature will be revealed in its true light, as a fragile, temporary truce that demands a daily toll. But before the giant steel gates and concrete reservoirs appeared, there was only damp, unyielding earth. The impenetrable, rotting jungles of Central America lived by their own laws. A narrow strip of fever swamps and marshes was the place where, for millions of years, two great oceans had crashed against the insurmountable wall of the continent. The idea of physically cutting through the continent was born in European offices, inspired by the recent triumph of the Suez Canal. Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and entrepreneur, viewed the map of Panama as a simple geometric problem.
He envisioned digging a straight canal at sea level, connecting the two great bodies of water without the use of complex mechanisms or locks.
This was a fatal error in perception, a blind application of experience from the arid Egyptian desert to the entirely alien environment of the humid tropics. The paper blueprints completely failed to account for the density, weight, and aggressiveness of the local biosphere. The land of Central America proved hostile to anything that attempted to disrupt its integrity. The soil here consisted of sticky clay and unstable volcanic rock, which turned into a flowing mass at the slightest moisture. French engineers began to dig into the isthmus, but the continent refused to yield. The trenches they dug were flooded by tropical downpours, and the walls collapsed, undoing months of grueling labor.
The earth behaved not like a solid, but like a thick liquid, constantly closing the wounds inflicted upon it.
The true master of these lands was not geology, but biology. Along with the rainy season, malaria and yellow fever, diseases whose nature no one understood at the time, swept through the construction camps. Hospitals filled up faster than new barracks could be built, and mortality rates among workers and engineers reached catastrophic levels. The French brought advanced technology with them, but the machines rusted in the mud while people died by the thousands from an invisible enemy. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and carbolic acid, which they tried unsuccessfully to use to disinfect the wards. Medical theory at the time blamed diseases on miasma, poisonous vapors from swamp mud. In an attempt to protect patients, doctors placed the legs of hospital beds in bowls of water to prevent ants from appearing. This decision proved fatal, as the stagnant water in the bowls created ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes, the actual carriers of the fever. The healthcare system, designed to save lives, turned into an efficient conveyor belt of death. The project was rapidly turning into a giant mass grave, swallowing up Europe's best specialists. By the end of the decade, the illusion of an easy victory had finally vanished. The company's financial pyramid collapsed, leaving behind abandoned, rusting equipment and thousands of crosses in the jungle. Nature easily and mercilessly digested humanity's first attempt to alter the geography. The isthmus remained untouched, proving that capital and ambition alone are not enough to reshape the planet. The continent's body proved too dense and toxic for European intervention. At the turn of the century, the geopolitical landscape shifted, and a new, rapidly growing empire took an interest in the project. The United States recognized the critical need for the rapid movement of its navy between the Atlantic and the Pacific. President Theodore Roosevelt viewed the canal not merely as a commercial enterprise, but as a fundamental instrument of global dominance. He needed not just a transit artery, but a fully controlled sphere of influence. The engineering task was preceded by tough political maneuvering. At the time, the territory of Panama was a province of Colombia, whose government refused to ratify an unfavorable treaty with the United States. The response was swift and pragmatic. American warships blockaded the coast, cutting off Colombian troops.
Under the cover of foreign guns, a group of Panamanian separatists declared the independence of a new republic.
It was an artificially created nation whose sole historical purpose was to legalize the transfer of land under another country's control. Power was wielded like a heavy construction tool, clearing the site before excavation began. The new treaty granted the United States a 10-mile-wide zone stretching from ocean to ocean for perpetual use. It was a unique territorial anomaly, a sovereign American strip cutting a foreign country in half. Within this zone, separate laws applied, a separate police force operated, and a rigid hierarchy took shape. The physical division of the continent began with the legal severing of the land.
The construction of the Great Road began with the creation of a colonial enclave.
Laborers were brought into this zone from all over the world, primarily from the Caribbean islands. Black workers became a cheap and easily replaceable resource in this gigantic machine. The system of segregation, embedded in the structure of pay and living conditions, divided people into gold and silver standards. White American engineers were paid in gold and lived in comfort, while black workers were paid in silver and lived in barracks. Control over nature was based on strict control over the masses. The main enemy during the first phase of construction was not the mountains or the rocks, but microscopic insects. William Crawford Gorgas, the project's chief medical officer, arrived at the isthmus with a radically new scientific concept. He knew that malaria and yellow fever were spread by specific species of mosquitoes, not by mythical vapors. This theory met with fierce resistance from conservative officials, who considered hunting insects a waste of budget funds.
But without victory in the biological war, any engineering effort was doomed to repeat the French scenario.
Gorgas launched a military sanitary operation of unprecedented scale, covering the entire construction zone. The territory was divided into sectors, in which special brigades methodically eliminated any pools of standing water. Thousands of gallons of oil and insecticides were poured daily into swamps, ditches, and puddles to kill the larvae. Workers' homes were fumigated with smoke, and fine copper screens were installed on the windows, cutting people off from the outside environment. It was a total cleansing of the biosphere, where every mosquito was treated as an enemy soldier. Gorgas's efforts began to bear fruit when mortality rates dropped sharply. Yellow fever was completely eradicated in the construction zone by the end of 1905, which seemed like a true miracle. Malaria cases were reduced to a manageable minimum, no longer posing a threat to the project's survival. A scientific approach had defeated the blind tropical threat, transforming the deadly jungle into a workable environment.
It was the first time in history that medicine had acted as heavy construction equipment, clearing the way for excavators.
The victory over disease gave the green light to the main phase of the grand construction project. Now engineers could focus on geological problems without fearing that their crews would die out by the end of the month. The continent's body had been stripped of its biological defenses, and now all that remained was to overcome its physical mass. The sanitary triumph created the illusion of humanity's complete mastery over the laws of nature. But the jungle had prepared the next level of resistance. Despite the victory over epidemics, the physical reality of the isthmus continued to defy the original plan. Chief Engineer John Stevens, after analyzing the volume of earth and the behavior of local rivers, came to a frightening conclusion. Building a canal at sea level was physically impossible without the risk of its complete destruction during the very first rainy season. The Chagres River, flowing through the construction zone, increased its volume hundreds of times during downpours, turning into an uncontrollable monster. Any straight trench would be instantly flooded and clogged with mud flows. A radical change in the entire project paradigm was required, abandoning a straight cut in favor of a complex mechanical solution. Stevens proposed not fighting the river, but using its destructive power to their advantage. The idea was to build a gigantic dam that would block the Chagres and create a vast artificial lake within the continent. Ships were to be lifted 26 meters above sea level, using a system of locks, cross the lake, and descend on the other side. This was a solution that changed the very principle of interacting with geography. Instead of lowering the mountains to the ships were lifted up into the mountains. Such a lock system required the construction of structures on a scale unprecedented in world history. Lake Gatun, formed after the dam's completion, was to become the largest artificial body of water on the planet, flooding hundreds of square kilometers of jungle. Water, which had been the builder's main enemy, became the primary lifting mechanism, supporting multi-ton steel hulls. This project challenged not only geology but also hydrodynamics, requiring absolute precision in calculations. An error in the design of the dam or the locks would have led to a catastrophic breach and the destruction of the entire riverbed. The shift to a lock system sparked fierce political debates in Washington, where many demanded a classic straight canal. Stevens had to use all his authority to prove the initial plan's flaws. He convinced the leadership that building locks would take less time and require the removal of less earth. The logic of taming the elements prevailed over the logic of brute destruction. The project transformed from a simple earthen trench into an extremely complex hydraulic engineering system. This moment became the point of no return, when the initial simplicity of the idea was replaced by complex engineering fragility. The canal was no longer conceived as a natural straight. It was becoming a machine requiring constant control and maintenance. A vast inland lake became the heart of this system, and gigantic steel gates served as its valves. The solution saved the project from certain collapse, but embedded a hidden vulnerability within it. Now the functioning of this global artery depended on the level of rainfall in the mountains of Central America. The most daunting test of technology and human endurance was the Culebra Cut, a mountain range blocking the water's path. Here, an artificial gorge 14 kilometers long had to be cut through solid rock and unstable strata. Unprecedented resources were thrown into this section, dozens of giant steam excavators and hundreds of train cars. Every movement of the bucket was accompanied by the clanging of metal, plumes of acrid black smoke, and the deafening roar of dynamite blasts. It was an industrial slaughterhouse, where machines methodically gnawed chunks from the body of the continent. The logistics of the excavation operated like a flawless clockwork mechanism that allowed for no downtime. Railroad tracks were laid directly on the open pit terraces and constantly moved forward as the trench deepened. Trains loaded with tons of rock and dirt ran at intervals of a few minutes, hauling away the waste to dam construction sites. It was a continuous choreography of steel and steam, where the slightest disruption to the schedule threatened to paralyze the entire system. Earth from the open pit was transported dozens of miles away, transforming the landscape beyond recognition. These landslides were a physical process of slow, inevitable extrusion. The weight of the adjacent mountains was so great that the soft lower layers of clay were simply squeezed into the void of the excavated channel. The bottom of the trench could suddenly rise several meters, breaking the rails and overturning the equipment. There was only one way to combat this: by widening the cut angle, removing more and more earth. The volume of excavated soil increased exponentially compared to the initial calculations. The Culebra Cut became a symbol of extreme exhaustion, where man and machine worked at the absolute limit of their endurance. The air in the gorge heated up to 50 degrees, mixing with coal fumes and dust. Workers were deafened by constant explosions and blinded by flying rock fragments. At this point, The continent resisted most fiercely, demanding colossal sacrifices for the right to cross its territory. The wound cut into the rocks became the physical embodiment of the price paid for altering the world's geography. While grueling earthworks were underway in the mountains, monumental structures were being erected at both ends of the future route. The Panama Canal locks were a marvel of industrial design, built almost entirely of monolithic concrete. Mass concrete pouring technology was applied here on a scale never seen before, forming walls tens of meters thick. Cement plants operated around the clock, supplying material that had to withstand colossal hydrostatic pressure. These chambers were not built as buildings, but as gigantic reservoirs to contain the power of the ocean. At the heart of this system were massive steel gates, each leaf weighing hundreds of tons. They were designed to be hollow inside so that the water would provide buoyancy and reduce the load on the giant hinges. The precision of the fit of these steel giants was such that, when closed, they did not let a single drop of water through. The gates opened and closed using powerful electric motors hidden within the thick concrete walls. It was a mechanism with clockwork precision, scaled up to the size of a multi-story building. A special towing system was developed to control the movement of ships inside the narrow concrete chambers. Electric locomotives, nicknamed mules, moved along cogged rails along the walls of the locks. They secured the ships with steel cables, rigidly fixing their position in space to prevent them from striking the concrete. Ship captains completely handed over control of their giants to the canal operators, submitting to the strict logic of the transit mechanism. Any independent action here threatened disaster and the destruction of the locks. The completion of the concrete work marked the transition from the chaos of earthen trenches to the sterile order of the industrial era. The canal had taken on its final, rigid form, the form of a system ready to receive its first ships. The concrete walls seemed indestructible, and the mechanics of the locks flawless. The illusion of total control over water and stone became absolute. The machine was ready to take its first breath and shoulder the weight of the world's fleet. August 1914 was marked by the quiet and routine passage of the first ship through the lock system. While Europe was plunging into the chaos of World War I, on the other side of the world, a triumph of logistical order was unfolding. The opening of the canal instantly redrew the map of global trade routes, shortening the journey between New York and San Francisco by thousands of nautical miles. The world suddenly shrank, and distances lost their daunting significance, and freight costs plummeted. The man-made waterway began to transport goods with an efficiency unmatched by any natural waterway. The first decades of operation were an era of quiet confidence in the perfection of the mechanism that had been created. The locks ran like clockwork, locomotives reliably pulled the ships, and the inland lake steadily supplied the system with fresh water. The canal seemed like an eternal monument to American engineering, impervious to time and wear. The geopolitical influence of the United States reached unprecedented heights as it held the main valve of world trade in its grasp. Every fleet on the planet now depended on the throughput capacity of these concrete chambers. Engineers at the turn of the century built a huge margin of safety into the lock's dimensions, believing they had anticipated the development of shipbuilding 100 years into the future. The structure easily handled the current load, showing no signs of fatigue or strain. The mechanism was in a state of perfect balance with its environment. But the laws of large systems are inexorable. Success inevitably breeds greater demands. The route's efficiency spurred the construction of ever more ships, increasing traffic density. The Pacific Ocean gradually became the main theater of commercial and military interests. The illusion of eternal control began to crack when the external environment started changing faster than the rigid concrete structure could adapt. The perfect machine was about to face overload. The outbreak of World War II instantly transformed this commercial artery into the most vulnerable military target on the planet. The strategic advantage of the fleet's rapid mobility became a matter of survival for the entire anti-Hitler coalition. A single direct hit by an aerial bomb on the steel lock gates could paralyze Allied logistics for months. The canal lost its status as a peaceful trade route and shifted to a state of siege. There arose an urgent need to protect a facility that had originally been designed to be open and vulnerable. The canal zone was bristling with anti-aircraft batteries, radar stations, and anti-submarine nets. The jungle around the locks was riddled with secret bunkers and underground command posts. Kilometers of steel cables were stretched across the Gatun Dam, the main vulnerability of the entire hydroelectric system, to protect it from torpedo bombers. Fears of sabotage reached paranoid levels, forcing authorities to inspect every ship entering the waterway. The infrastructure was reinforced with heavy military armor in an attempt to protect the fragile lock mechanisms. The war also revealed the physical limitations of the canal's capacity, as new battleships struggled to squeeze into the concrete chambers. Huge warships passed through the locks with only a few inches to spare from the walls, causing engineers to hold their breath. The canal withstood the strain of war, allowing tens of thousands of ships carrying troops and supplies to pass through. It fulfilled its role as an instrument of global power, securing victory on two oceans simultaneously. But this period left an indelible mark on the understanding of its vulnerability. The war proved that the system could no longer exist outside the context of global threats. The open waterway became a hostage to its own strategic importance, requiring constant physical protection. The weight of responsibility for global shipping lanes began to strain the infrastructure, no less than the millions of tons of cargo passing through it. The stress experience laid the groundwork for future crises, demonstrating that the rigid framework of 1914 was becoming too narrow for the New World. The second half of the 20th century became an era of unbridled economic growth in the container revolution. Global trade demanded the movement of goods in volumes unimaginable to the canal's builders. Business logic dictated an ironclad rule. The larger the ship, the cheaper the cost of delivering a unit of cargo. Shipyards began launching giant container ships, tankers, and dry cargo ships, whose dimensions came very close to the dimensions of the lock chambers. The term Panamax emerged, the maximum size of a ship capable of squeezing through the concrete gates. Panamax-class ships entered the locks almost scraping against the walls, chipping the paint on their sides and demanding surgical precision from the lock operators. The transit time for each of these giants increased, slowing down the overall flow of traffic along the entire transit route. Ocean traffic jams at the canal entrances became commonplace. Dozens of ships sat in the roadstead for weeks, waiting for their turn. The rigid geometry of the early 20th century design came into direct conflict with the ambitions of the modern economy. The artery began to choke, unable to keep pace with the pulse of a growing world. An additional burden was created by the wear and tear of the mechanisms themselves, which had been operating nonstop for decades. The original gears, motors, and steel gates required increasingly frequent and lengthy repairs. Every time one of the chambers was shut down for maintenance, it triggered a chain reaction of delays across the globe. Maintenance had turned into a continuous open-heart surgery where any mistake cost millions of dollars. Engineers tried to squeeze the maximum out of the aging infrastructure by installing modern electronics on top of the antiquated machinery. By the end of the millennium, it had become clear that global logistics had outgrown its main transit hub. New post-Panamax-class ships were physically unable to enter the canal, forcing shipping companies to seek alternative, longer routes. The instrument of power that once controlled trade flows began to hinder them. The threat of losing influence and the status of the planet's main crossroads became real. Leaving the system in its original form meant condemning it to gradual decline and the loss of strategic significance. An inevitable need arose for radical intervention, for a large-scale modernization comparable in complexity to the original construction. It was necessary to cut through new passages and build new gigantic locks capable of accommodating the ships of the future. The idea for salvation lay in duplicating the system, in widening the bottleneck. But every new attempt to change the scale entailed unpredictable consequences for the balance of the entire structure. The cost of expansion turned out to be far higher than the cost of the cubic meters of poured concrete. The large-scale expansion project, completed in 2016, gave the global shipping industry gigantic new locks. They allowed the passage of enormous modern vessels capable of carrying 3 times as much cargo. On the surface, it looked like yet another victory of engineering genius over the limitations of space. The new concrete chambers were awe-inspiring in their size, and the massive sliding gates operated flawlessly. The system had once again adapted to the scale of the global economy, preventing a transport collapse. But this grand rescue gave rise to a new, far more terrifying vulnerability, hidden in the very nature of the technology. Each cycle of operation of the giant locks requires the discharge of a colossal volume of fresh water from the inland lake into the ocean. Despite the use of water-conserving basins, the new chambers are sucking liquid from the continent at an alarming rate. Water has become the scarcest and most valuable resource, ensuring the functioning of the global transport chain. A mechanism dependent on rainfall has begun to devour its own lifeblood. Global climate change has struck this fragile dependency with unpredictable ferocity. Rainy seasons have become erratic, while droughts have grown longer and more extreme. Water levels in the artificial lakes periodically drop to critical levels, at which safe navigation of heavy vessels becomes impossible. To maintain lake levels, projects are being considered to divert water from neighboring spillways, which threatens to destroy other ecosystems. Engineering intervention requires further interventions, spiraling the environmental burden. The system survives only through constant, desperate reshaping of the landscape. The current state of the system is a constant balancing act on the brink of resource depletion. It is no longer merely a transit route. It is an extremely complex water distribution mechanism that determines the fate of a continent and its economy. Widening the channel solved the problem of ship size, but exposed a fundamental dependence on the whims of nature. The artificial valve operates at the limits of hydrology, proving that infinite growth in a closed physical system is impossible. The new form ensured survival but permanently stripped the project of the illusion of autonomous stability. The familiar image of an ideal waterway, along which ocean giants glide serenely, remains nothing more than a soothing television image. If you strip away the outer layer of concrete and steel, the ceaseless tension of forces is laid bare. Not a trace remains of the builders' initial confidence in their complete mastery over geography. The artificial valve that cut through the continent pulses with its last ounce of strength, trying to let through volumes for which this land was never prepared. This grandiose project is a story of how massive ambitions collide with the physical limits of the planet. The mechanism created has outgrown its original form, becoming too dependent, too voracious, and vulnerable to the slightest climatic shifts. It is a monument to human stubbornness, which refuses to back down even in the face of the threat of basic resource depletion. To maintain the illusion of seamless global logistics, people forced water to flow against natural cycles, draining life from tropical lakes.